Good morning. I wonder how you view our church situation during the current lockdown. It's a time which also happens to be the time of selling the church building and moving on. So, like it or not, as a church community, we are facing big changes. For most people, I think it's a time of some sadness as we think about the freedoms we've lost during this latest lockdown. Maybe we're also looking back to the good times we had in this building and feeling sad at their passing. I think for many people there is a sense of mourning, a sense of loss. And of course, to make things worse, we can't at present meet up in person to give each other a hug and encourage one another. But of course, it isn't just our local church that's affected. On a global scale, this pandemic has brought the biggest disruption to the way we do church for decades, maybe even since World War II. But I think that all this disruption has another side to it, because it's forcing churches to evaluate everything we do and look for new ways to do the things that matter most to us. It's simply not an option to carry on doing everything the way we've grown comfortable with over the past years. It's not an option to just sit down and do nothing and wait until the virus passes and we can go back to our old ways. Those are not viable options. We have to figure out what really matters to us as church and then find ways of doing those things in the midst of government restrictions and at the time of leaving the building. But before we look at what we as church should be doing now, I want to start by looking backwards to the very beginning of the church in the book of Acts, so that we can get a better understanding of what really matters in church. So to set the scene, it was the day of Pentecost, which is a Jewish festival 50 days after Passover. And Jerusalem was packed with Jews from all across the Middle East, because Passover is one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals when all Jews were meant to gather in Jerusalem and meet together in the temple and celebrate together. Early in the morning of that day, Jesus' disciples had gathered together indoors, when suddenly there was the sound of a loud wind, and what looked like flames appeared on each person. The Holy Spirit filled them and they began talking loudly in languages that they had never learned. Now, pretty soon they seemed to have hit the exit and spilled out into the streets, where they created quite a stir among the visiting crowds. And all those visitors had one question: how come these Galileans are praising God in our languages? What is going on? So Peter stepped up as spokesman and preached a powerful sermon that cut people to the heart. And around 3,000 people accepted Jesus as their Lord and were baptized that day. Suddenly the church was born, and Jesus' followers, who had been around 500 people, 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6, if you want to know where I get the number from, the church had been around 500 people, and suddenly they're joined by another 3,000 people from all over the Middle East. Can you imagine the challenge of leading such an enormous group and figuring out, well, what is it we're meant to do? what is this newborn church meant to be doing? And how do we do it? Well, here's what the apostles came up with. And I'm going to read from Acts 2, verse 42. They, that is the believers, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favour of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So, what were the believers doing? Well, simply taking what it says in the verses. Firstly, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. So the apostles are teaching everyone about the things that Jesus said and the things that he had done. They devoted themselves to fellowship. They devoted themselves to sharing communion. And they devoted themselves to prayer. The apostles performed signs and wonders. So many that it doesn't even bother mentioning what they were. All the believers were together. They shared everything they had and gave to those in need. And then they kept meeting up. They met together in the temple in Jerusalem. So that's church in the big. All 3,500 people were attending meetings led by the apostles. But then also, they shared communion and meals in homes. That's church in the small, where the believing residents of Jerusalem opened their homes and shared meals with the visitors. And they praised God. Now, I love that picture of a vibrant, living, loving church. It's just amazing. Wouldn't you like to belong to a church like that? And did you notice what the result was of people living that way? Verse 47, they enjoyed the favour of all the people, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. I believe that a spirit-filled, living, vibrant, loving church will grow. Because the deepest heart desire of humans is to love and be loved. So when people outside the church see Christians really loving one another and encounter that love for themselves, they will know that God is at work, and many will want to be a part of it. In fact, I believe that verse, Acts 2, verse 47, is really a fulfillment of what Jesus said in John 13, verse 34 and 35. Jesus said, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." So people outside the church are meant to be able to recognise us by our love. And in that early church in Jerusalem, they could do exactly that. And it led to many people following Jesus. People saw the love they had been looking for all their lives. And then they experienced the love they had been looking for all their lives. And then they started to give that love to other people as well. In due course, however, the church in Jerusalem started to be persecuted by the Jewish leaders, and most believers were scattered across Judea, Samaria, and eventually all across the Roman Empire. But that didn't stop the church from growing. It was like someone had tried to put out a fire by scattering the embers, and each place a hot ember landed, a new fire broke out, until at the end of the book of Acts, when Paul arrives in Rome as a prisoner, there is already a thriving church there. We actually don't have much idea who started that church, but it seems likely that some unknown believer or group of believers had arrived in Rome and started telling other people about Jesus, and those people had believed, and so a church had grown. So what was it that was so powerfully attractive about these early churches? Well, I think that we can describe their values as, firstly, loving God, secondly, loving God's family, and thirdly, loving others into God's family. Everything those churches in the book of Acts did appears to be as a result of at least one of these aims. And if you skim through the book of Acts from chapter 2 onwards and look at what the early churches were doing, under the heading of loving God, you'll see that they're spending time in praise and worship, and they were remembering Jesus' sacrifice through communion. And they were teaching people about God's love and really inciting each other to love God more. Under the heading of loving God's family, they were meeting together and eating together all the time, and praying and using gifts of the Spirit to bless each other, and sharing everything they had so that no one was in need. Church, as the family of God, was central to those people's lives. Church wasn't just something they did on the Sabbath, it was something they lived 24/7. And then under the heading of loving others into God's family, they were praying that God would enable them to tell people about Jesus, that God would enable them to tell people about Jesus with boldness, even though they're being persecuted. And then having prayed that, they went out and did it. And they were using gifts of the Spirit to bless other people. And as a result, many people all across the Roman Empire started to follow Jesus. So those priorities of loving God, loving God's family, and loving others into God's family underpinned everything the believers were doing. And as a result, many thousands of people came to follow Jesus. Now, of course, that was a long time ago in a land far, far away. But I believe it can teach us something about what really matters in church today. Obviously, our society and our laws are very different from New Testament times. But I believe that the church's priorities should still be to love God, to love God's family, and to love others into God's family. Those priorities seem to me to be timeless. What has changed over the centuries, and obviously more especially in the current situation, is the way that we fulfill those priorities. So the priorities of love for God, for God's family, and loving people into God's family, those priorities remain the same. But the way that we actually do that has to fit in with our current situation. For a while, we can't meet face to face, either for church in the big on a Sunday morning or for church in the small in our life groups. But those are both really important, so we need to find new ways of meeting. And I do thank God for modern technology which allows us to meet up virtually. If you think about it, even 20, 25 years ago, we would not have been able to do church in the way that we are still able to do it in this pandemic. Modern technology can be used for enormous good. And so let's make full use of that, make full use of what is possible, rather than getting upset or depressed about the things that aren't possible. And if we work through those priorities of church, you'll see that there's still an awful lot that is possible, even in the current situation. Because we can still love God through spending time together in praise and worship. We can remember Jesus' sacrifice through communion. We can teach people about God's love, and we can really incite each other to love God more. We may be doing that virtually, but the effects are real. And remember that the big advantage of having our services on YouTube and on Facebook is that people can access them at any time from anywhere in the world, as long as they've got an internet connection. So a worker on an oil rig in the middle of the North Sea would be able to join our services. Someone who's interested in Christianity in a closed country far away could join our services, see what we're talking about, learn about Jesus. And amazingly, the sermons we're preaching now could possibly bear fruit in years' time if they remain online. And if you find a sermon that's helpful to you, it's really easy to share that with other people so that they can be blessed too. All you do is send them the link. When we think about how we can still love God's family, well, we can meet together online. We can pray for each other. We can use gifts of the Spirit to bless each other. And we can share generously so that no one is in need. We can chat with each other on the phone or online, video calls. We can pray for each other. I know we can't hug each other, and that is really difficult for a lot of people. But there are many things that we can do. You know, I've been part of life groups for about 40 years. But I can honestly say that I appreciate our life group meetings now far more than I have ever done before. And that isn't just because of Ian and Gary's bad jokes. Walking through these difficult times with other Christians to support and encourage us is vital. So if you're not yet in a life group, please join one at a time that fits your schedule. There are quite a few different life groups around, different times. Please join one, and then you can be loved and supported by other Christians. And you don't even need to leave your armchair. And when we're thinking about loving other people into God's family, we can still pray for people. We can still show love to them by using gifts of the Spirit to bless them. We can tell them about God's love. We can't invite them into our homes at present, but we can chat to them outdoors, over the garden fence, or we can phone them, we can video call them. Now, when you read the book of Acts, the people in the churches in the book of Acts were totally committed to telling other people about Jesus. Most British churches probably aren't. And even the best churches probably have a large percentage of the congregation who leave that sort of thing to their pastors. But the Bible makes it clear that each one of us is meant to be witnesses of the things we have seen God do. And we can do that by firstly praying. And then when we see answers to prayer, that blessing isn't just for us to enjoy. It's something we're meant to share with others both inside and outside God's family, so that they're blessed and challenged as well. God is alive. He's working in our lives. He answers prayer. And people need to know that. But for most people, it's not that easy to keep on doing the right things during these difficult times. If we're honest, it takes effort, and our human nature might like to stop trying. We can be a bit lazy. And it takes perseverance at times when we might be inclined to give up. And of course we must remember that we have an enemy, the devil, who is totally opposed to love. He absolutely detests love in any form and does all he can to stamp it out. Now, let's not give him too much credit for bad things happening or for us stopping doing the good things we should be doing. We don't want to give him credit for what's our failings. But at the same time, let's always be aware that there is an enemy who wants the church to fail and he wants love to fail. So, what are the real battleground areas we followers of Jesus need to fight for and persist in doing? We could probably pick all of the things that the early church were doing. The reason they're recorded is because they matter. But I want to just pick up on 4 things which I feel are particularly important for us today. You may read the book of Acts and come up with a different list, but I think there would be at least some overlap. Firstly, we need to fight isolation. We need to keep on meeting. It is vitally important for all God's people that we don't become isolated from one another. We need to work hard to support and encourage and pray for one another. So, as I said earlier, join a life group. Ring your church friends. Keep in touch. We are all in this together, and we need to stick together and support one another. Secondly, we need to share the good news of Jesus. We need to tell people about how good God is. Jesus is alive. He is active today. He answers prayer. So let's tell people these truths. A lot of people get hung up on thinking they don't know the answers to complicated theological questions. Guess what? Neither do the theologians. They disagree. That doesn't matter. Tell people what you do know. Tell people about the Jesus you know. Tell people what you have seen in answers to prayer. That's all the early believers did. Thirdly, we need to share our money generously. When you read the stories of those early churches in the book of Acts, there was this extraordinary generosity. Now, that doesn't come terribly easy to us. It's human nature for us to be greedy. We don't always want to share. But one of the things that Marcus Rashford has achieved with his campaign to feed kids from poorer households is that he has highlighted the fact that in Britain, the sixth richest country in the world, we still have enormous problems with poverty. The government has been pushed, shamed, whatever, into increasing their help. But maybe as Christians, we also need to be thinking about how we can play our part in helping those in need in our communities. The fourth thing I want to highlight is we need to pray. Prayer is mentioned 31 times in the book of Acts in only 28 chapters. That shows how important it is. But most of us probably don't find it easy to pray continuously. And particularly in our current situation, it's sometimes really hard to know how to pray. But the point is, we must not give up. We may not know properly how to pray, but pray anyway. Do the best you can. A few years ago, I went to the Pioneer Leaders Conference in Southampton, and there was a speaker called Brian Heasley, who is the UK National Director of 24/7 Prayer. And he really challenged some of my thinking on prayer. You see, I think most of us tend to look for quality in prayer. We're always looking for how can we pray powerfully and see answers straight away. And this guy shocked me by challenging everyone to forget about the quality and go for the quantity in prayer. He challenged us to be more disciplined in praying even when nothing looks to be happening. And he challenged us to aim for the quantity of time praying in order that sometimes we would get a few quality moments. You see, if we're honest, many of us would have to admit that we have a tendency to base our prayer effort on the results we've seen recently. If God has done something amazing, then we're really up for prayer for a short while. But when we don't see instant answers to prayer, we tend to let things slip and we become sloppy in prayer and we let the quantity drop. Brian Heasley's challenge was to be disciplined in prayer and to put in the quantity of prayer in order that sometimes we may have those amazing highs when we see real quality in prayer and see miracles happening. To my mind, it's very like nature photography. Some of you will know that I love taking photos and in particular getting close-ups of wildlife. But in order to have any chance of achieving that, I do need to put in the hours walking around the countryside with my camera at the ready. And I often need to take hundreds of photos, or even thousands, in order to get just a few that are really good. Wild animals don't come to order, they can't be timetabled, they don't come looking for me, asking me to take their photo. So I need to put in the hours looking for them if I am to have any chance of getting a photo. I need to get up early and be persistent in doing the right thing at the right time if I'm to stand any chance of getting a good shot. Prayer is like that. We have to keep putting in the hours. We have to keep trying, never giving up. We have to keep on being in the right place, doing the right thing, until we see the miracle happen. Now, all these things need effort. It's easier not to try. But if we do try, we can change the world around us. Through prayer, God has given us the power to change the world around us. There's a wonderful bit in The Lord of the Rings where Frodo says to Gandalf, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." So, I want to ask, is now the time that God is prodding us to get more active in showing his love to other people in ways we haven't done before? Is now the time that God is prodding us to get more involved in church, even if it's only from our armchairs at present? And is now the time that God is prodding us to pray more? Thanks for listening. May God bless you this week.